Garrett is next, and she's going to talk to us a little bit more about what chefs should know about things like the Farm Bill, which are so intimidating. Even as a journalist, I don't want to get on that topic, and how their sources, Farm Bill, and how your sourcing impacts the diversity of farms and the environment. So here we go.
Great, thanks, Whitney. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
This is such a pleasure and such an honor, I must say. I've learned so much from my fellow panelists and look forward to learning even more from Forrest beside me. So I am teaching at American University School of International Service, and I just wanted to give you all a little report from academia to say food is huge. It's booming. I was just at a series of conferences this fall, and across the disciplines, from social science to political science, to physical science, to law schools. This is the huge issue now in legal theory, is dealing with CAFOs, why isn't Clean Water Act working, labor issues, immigration, and farm workers. So across academia, just within the last 5 years, the issues of agri-food are dominating syllabi, dominating curriculum, dominating the landscape on campuses. And they're transforming those campuses and those syllabi and those curriculum, because they are such intractable, difficult problems that rural soc can't handle it. And soil conservation can't handle it. Soil agronomy can't handle it, econ can't handle it. They have to work together. So the very problems themselves are so multidisciplinary that they're demanding that academia step back and talk to each other in a way that I don't think has ever happened. So it's transforming academia in a very exciting way. All of the undergrads coming in and the grad students coming in, the non-traditional students coming in are interested in hunger, interested in obesity problems, the discourse of obesity, which is a contested discourse, food desert, a contested discourse, the issue of labor. All of these things are drawing people to academia to study the issue and then get back into the field, as it were, and help solve the problems. So it's making academia more interdisciplinary and also more engaged, because you're going into the subject to figure out how to solve it, how best to improve the situation. So academia now has a very nice applied scholarship, academic civic engagement, community university partnerships are built around agri-food studies in a very exciting way. So meanwhile, that's happening over in academia. And in the public at large, the urban landscape is being transformed. You've got farms, gardens, little plots of land that were abandoned in Detroit, some of the post-industrial landscapes now being filled with urban gardens and with aquaculture and with vertical gardens. So the physical landscape of cities are being transformed with this new agri-food movement, which is a little bit of a misnomer since there's so many movements happening, but we can just kind of use the term movement to think through it. So I want to talk a little bit about how the movement in academia and the movement in community-based action in the cities and in suburban areas is addressing policy. I think people enter into sustainable ag because of pleasure, because it tastes good, because food's better when it's fresh, when it's seasonal, when it's local, when it's real. Meat tastes better when it's not from a CAFO situation. So pleasure draws people a lot of times to this issue, but then when they get to the issue, they immediately see that there's issues of equity and of justice and of environmental sustainability and the need for community engagement and for policy engagement. So this is a very exciting moment, because I think what began maybe as a series of disparate movements are now collectively looking at the Farm Bill and trying to figure out what in the world happened to create such a quagmire. And so now, I mean, we're in Washington, D.C., so I think we're at the heart of this. The U.S. Farm Bill influences so many aspects of the U.S., from nutrition, from food stamps, research, conservation titles, commodity crop, how rural communities develop or not develop. It also influences villages around the world. In fact, most villages around the world are dealing with repercussions of U.S. agricultural policy in indirect or direct ways. So the Farm Bill itself, this funny, enormous quagmire, many hundred pages long document that actually references previous many hundred-page documents that reference previous ones. It's like a lifelong decision to dive into it. And there's actually many people here who know even more about the Farm Bill than I am going to be talking about today. It began in the 30s, in the 1930s. As a response, does anyone know what began the first Farm Bill? The Dust Bowl, exactly, good. So the whole region of the Midwest and the Southwest, those areas around Oklahoma and Texas, had been perennial grasses, grazing lands. And a lot of that was plowed up to grow an annual crop, wheat, to go feed Europe. Again, we've got this whole like feed Europe in the First World War. And so you had a lot of regions of the country that had very deep roots. Those perennial prairie grasses had very deep roots. When those are pulled up and you have annual crops there, the minute a drought comes, there's no root system to hold the water, and that topsoil just blows away, which is what happened. And the Dust Bowl occurred in the mid-1930s, and there was one point, the one dust storm that was so bad that dust actually reached Washington, D.C., FDR's desk. It was dusty. So of course he thought, it's a problem, let's do something about it. Let's think about soil conservation from a federal level. And let's think about overproduction of grain crops from a federal level. Because overproduction of grain crops is not only terrible for the soil, it's also bad for farmers because the price crashes. And so after World War I, there was the Depression and there was a price collapse of grain, and farmers were desperate, and then you had the Dust Bowl there. And so the initial Agricultural Adjustment Act of the 30s attempted to put a price floor so the price would never fall below that price floor, and farmers would be able to always get some kind of wage, some kind of income. And also, the purpose of the Farm Bill was to keep some parts of the land idle or not cultivated, so as to provide a soil bank or help build up soil conservation. There was also a grain reserve built in that would take some of the excess that was produced and keep it, and that would stabilize price. It was like a supply management, and also it could be, if there was a crop failure in the subsequent years, that grain reserve would help stabilize food security issues. Cut to the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, and you had a different model of what ag policy could be. The 1970s, the government wanted a lot of production, but they wanted it to go out, again, into the world, into new markets, to Russia, even though it was in the middle of the Cold War, and to newly independent post-colonial countries. So this was a way to kind of give aid to newly post-colonial countries to lure them to follow the capitalist as opposed to the communist logic, because there was a tension between capitalism and communism in the Cold War. So there was a whole geopolitical understanding of overproduction of grains, and so there was a lot of production in the 1970s. You had new technologies, the Green Revolution, you had new seeds, hybrid seeds, which under certain conditions have a high yield per hectare. And so you had a lot of production in the 1970s, but what that actually meant, because you had production elsewhere in the world because of the Green Revolution, was a price collapse in the 80s. And the early 80s was a devastating price collapse in the US. And so you had farm prices, first you had the grain prices plummet in the course of a year, and then you had farmland value half. So in 1985, the farmland was half of what it had been 2 years before. Farmer suicides, farmer bankruptcies, a whole section of rural America couldn't bear the financial pressures and went out of business. And the Farm Bill again tried to figure out how to provide supports, how to help out, and some of the supports helped and some of them didn't. And there was also the beginning of conservation titles getting renewed in the mid-80s, because the argument was, environmentalists said, keep that highly erodible hillside uncultivated, it will help the waterways and it will help overproduction. So some good conservation programs began in the 80s. In the 90s, that changed again. The 90s were the beginning of real neoliberalization, real globalization. You had the Uruguay Round, the WTO, you had NAFTA, and all of a sudden it was really a time to have exports of grain crops, exports of the various produce in the US, and those were subsidized in a way that it was cheaper it went to market cheaper than it cost to produce. There was a whole flooding of corn and flooding of various crops. So in the 1990s, there were WTO pressures and there was domestic pressures, and there was direct payments instituted in the 1990s, which are going to be cut from the Senate and the House versions of the most recent Farm Bill. But the direct payments, which is just giving the farmers money to balance out the volatility of the prices, had to have conservation compliance. And so this is a good thing. And so I think as we think about what our ideal Farm Bill would be, when there is support for growers, the general consensus among environmentalists, and even many of the growers, is that it has to be with conservation compliance. Because if there isn't conservation compliance with these large-scale growing, the pressure is just to grow fence row to fence row, and you have all the sediment from those row crops in the Midwest, and all of the waste from the CAFOs as well going into the Mississippi River and creating a dead zone in the Gulf the size of New Jersey, which you all know this happens every year. So when we think about what is the goal for a farm bill, it needs to have some degree of conservation, just like that original farm bill in the 1930s. It needs to have some price support for growers, but not just to grow the usual commodity crops that frankly these days go to feedlots, go to corn syrup, and go to ethanol. They aren't even going to good food. So we need to think about how subsidies can help small-scale growers and medium-sized growers stay farming and stay in business, but be growing agroecologically, be growing fruits and vegetables, which are called specialty crops, as if they're kind of peripheral in the farm bill. And they need to be helping farmers convert from row crops and conventional grain crops to more diversified farming systems that have, as Forrest is going to be telling us about, some produce, some livestock, some horticulture, and a kind of a diversified farming system. In closing, I will just say some of the key things that I think are important for us to think about when we envision an ideal farm bill. Because I think what's so important about right now is that finally you've got many people even knowing what a farm bill is and thinking about it. And half the problem with the previous farm bills is that it was just off everyone's radar. If you weren't a grower receiving from it, then it was really off your radar. And right now we need to think about a farm bill that supports food security. The House version of the farm bill proposes a $40 billion cut in supplemental nutritional assistance programs, food stamps. Some Boston pediatrics have issued a report last week that would be a public health crisis for young people because it would decrease food security so intensely and so rapidly in households across America. And we also need to think about a farm bill that regulates CAFOs, just as we heard, and that thinks through animal welfare, and that also thinks about labor. Right now, labor is actually not in the farm bill, but I just wanted to really talk about the idea that just recently you've got an increase finally in consciousness about farm worker labor issues in agriculture. 85% of our produce is picked by hand, much of that by migrant, undocumented, illegal is what's called, a very unfortunate adjective, but undocumented workers. And restaurant workers who right now receive a $2.13 a minimum wage. And so there is a growing labor consciousness among food workers and farm workers to try to think through what would a food system look like that's not just serving delicious and seasonal and sustainable food, but it's also treating the hands that fix that food equitably, justly, and thinking through that. How would policy ensure that that happens? And so finally, I just wanted to end by saying one of the characteristics of agriculture right now is an unprecedented consolidation, a political economy that's highly concentrated. So you had a lot of acquisitions and mergers in the 1990s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s, and the food industry embodies that. So you have one or two seed companies owning 90% of the corn seed, of the 75% of the soybean seed. You've got one or two meat companies owning a huge amount of the vertical integration of the meat packing and of the slaughtering and of the contracting. And you've got just a handful of distributors that are really, Walmart I think is 25% of the food that's grown and sold in the US goes through Walmart. So an enormous concentration and consolidation in political economy. And those companies that have consolidated can buy low and sell high. And so it's up to us to think through a policy that is thinking through monopoly and antitrust policy that opens up the market and opens up the landscape. Government will certainly not save this issue or solve all the problems, but right now the policy is actively thwarting the really good alternatives that are happening. So what would it look like, a policy that just allows these wonderful initiatives and slow food movements and food justice movements to just happen on their own or work with each other? So diversity, I think, is one of our key words. A political economic diversity, many distributors, many mom and pop stores, many restaurants, not just a handful of corporate giants, and also an agricultural biodiversity. Between 1900 and 2000, 100 years, the world lost 75% of its agricultural biodiversity. It's gone. It just happened. It's just gone. And that was in the year 2000, so now we're 14 years later. So really thinking about agricultural biodiversity is a very empowering way of thinking about farming and thinking about being a part of farming, because humans aren't the problem. Humans are the solution in agricultural biodiversity. So biodiversity in the environmental sense, there's a whole conservation biology sense that humans, they just need to get out of the way, and then biodiversity can come back. And agricultural biodiversity, that's the opposite. You need humans growing different varieties, breeding different varieties, eating, enjoying, loving, sharing, saving different cultivars, different native varieties. So every time you order in a restaurant, or if you're a chef, put on the menu an old cultivar, a neglected or underutilized species, a rye seed that hasn't been grown, you are contributing to agricultural biodiversity conservation in a very active and empowering way, in a very creative way, I think. So I just wanted to end with the idea that maybe a farm policy that we're aiming for allows diversity, both political and economic and ecological diversity, to flourish and feed us. Thank you.